Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's our great pleasure to have such prominent panelists here. Before I introduce them formally, please take a note. The view expressed here by the panelists in the session are their personal views only and should not be attributed to their organization. The information provided should not be relied upon for business purpose or taking into consideration legal advice. And our first panelist is Mr. Dermot Horgan, and he's very well-known, established expert in this field, and of course, expert in intellectual property, trademark, trade secret, trade dress, and his skill set extends to U.S. international practice. He frequently speaks in international property issues, the law of music, or the video licensing and due diligence in merger and acquisition.
In the United States, the three principal features of trademark ownership are the right to use, the right to enforce, and the right to register. It's like three wheels of a bicycle. Those are really the three most significant pieces. The right to use is, essentially the ability, the right to put the mark on goods and services that you sell in commerce. The right to enforce is to stop others from using marks that are identical or confusingly similar. And the right to register is to obtain a registration. It's not always the case that the owner of a mark can exercise all three rights, and we'll talk about that at various points this afternoon. Clearly, you always must have the right to use it, and to some extent you must have the right to stop others. But occasionally there'll be instances where you do not have the right to register. Could arise because there's already a confusingly similar prior mark that's registered ahead of you and prevents you getting on the register. But that doesn't necessarily stop you from getting, ownership in its essential form. So in the United States, to get ownership of a mark, the real essential feature is use. Ownership goes to the first to use the mark in commerce. There's two types of use. There's actual use. I put my mark on a product and I sell it to a willing buyer in commerce, which is typically in another state. Or a service. I offer a service. My firm offers legal services under the name IpHorgan to people all around the United States and around the world. That could be use of a mark on a service. We also have a concept of constructive use, which derives from filing an application. So if I file an application with the United States Trademark and Copyright Office, and I haven't actually put the mark on a product or service yet, I can still get a constructive use date based on that filing. I ultimately have to perfect that by actually using the mark before I get a right that's fully enforceable. I think the slides are out of zoom here, so maybe pay no attention to the slides behind the curtain and stick with me. So to give you a couple of examples on how that might work. Let's say on January 1 of 2018, I began selling widgets under the trademark Hotshot. So I begin sales. I'm based in Chicago, so I sell widgets to someone in New York under the trademark Hotshot. 6 months later, someone says, well, that's a great product. I'm going to file an application for that mark Hotshot. I think it's really good for widgets. And they file an application with the United States Trademark and Copyright Office. Because I'm the first to use that mark, my use predates their filing. I think we're actually on the right one here. Okay, cool. So this is the tricycle I was telling you about. And we'll move forward here. I don't know how to bounce this. So taking my example, I used the mark on January 18, 2018 on the products. Someone else files an application. This is Party B, 6 months later, June 18. Because my use predates their application, in the United States, I'm the owner of the mark, which is a little bit different than what we see in most of the rest of the world. In most countries, this date here would be the decisive one. If I'm in China and I file an application, it's really going to be down to the application date that's going to determine the ownership. And that's pretty much the case in most of the world, with a few limited exceptions. Let's take a second example. This is where we talk a little bit about constructive use. I file an application on January 18. Someone begins use on June 18. My application goes to registration, and to proceed to registration, I actually have to use the mark. In the United States, use is still the touchstone. And at that point, my constructive use date relates back to the filing date. And that establishes, you know, my ownership over this later party. So if use is the all-important thing, why bother getting a registration in the United States? Because, you know, the first to use, whether it's constructive use or actual use, is always going to trump. Well, there's a few reasons to do it. One, getting a registration conveys a presumption of ownership. I don't actually have to go out and prove that I began using the mark on January 18. And as many of you will know from your own experience, trying to dig up that type of evidence 6, 7, 10 years later is next to impossible, very often, to have the documentation relating to earlier sales. So the registration gives me a presumption of ownership. It'll block others from getting registrations themselves. Because the registration is there, the USPTO will examine for confusingly similar later applications and will cite my registration against them. It gives me the right to use the registration symbol, which puts people on notice of the fact that my mark is registered and lends an air of authenticity to what I'm doing when I'm selling my products or services in the marketplace. It's an asset that is often very important in a sale and things like that. Documentation, such as a registration, is very important because it shows, conveys this presumption of ownership, and it's something that buyers will always look to see whether there are registrations. Again, not having a registration doesn't mean you don't own the mark, but having that registration proves on its face, or is a degree of proof on its face, that you have the registration. And finally, if I have a registered trademark, I can record it with customs in the United States. And that will oftentimes be effective in preventing the importation of counterfeits and products of that like. I can't do that with what's called a common law mark, one that's based exclusively on use. So that's the importance of having a registration. Now, many of you probably have had some experience with getting registrations in the United States. The process is multifaceted. The USPTO, when an application is filed, will certainly examine to make sure that the goods and services are properly described, that they're satisfied with the classification, and that the proper fees have been paid. They'll also undertake a substantive examination. They'll want to make sure that the mark is distinctive, that it's capable of being a trademark. And they'll also examine it against existing prior applications and registrations for confusing similarity. They will not examine it against common law marks, but they will examine it against previously registered marks. Once you go through that process, which sometimes can be very simple and sometimes can be very painstaking in terms of getting there. Very often when an issue comes up during examination, especially if it's a substantive refusal based on confusing similarity or something of that nature, it's a pretty extensive process to file a substantive brief to rebut that and overcome it. But assuming that you do, the application is then published for opposition, and that really allows anybody out there with a prior right or who believes they'll be harmed to oppose your application. Maybe they have a right that they own, maybe they feel the mark is descriptive, maybe they feel that it makes some sort of unfair association. There's a whole myriad of different grounds that can be exercised for that. And then you've got the completion process. Now, as I said at the outset, ownership is ultimately based on use. So if my application is based on use, once I complete the opposition period, it goes straight to registration. If it's based on intent to use, remember we talked about the earlier one with the constructive use date, those applications go to what's called allowance. An allowance basically gives me a 6-month window to put the mark into use on the goods and services claim. And I can get up to 5 extensions of that, so you can stretch it out for approximately 3 years. But ultimately, I have to put the mark into use in order to get the registration to issue. So that's the typical path. Now, foreign applicants outside of the United States have a couple of other arrows in their quiver that they can use. They can proceed under the Paris Convention, which in US law is 44E, and that actually allows you to get a registration without showing use. It basically allows you to base an application in the United States on a registration in your home country. And so long as the goods and services you're claiming in the United States are within the scope of that registration in your home country, and you go through examination and all the rest of it, you can get a registration without use. And secondly, you have the Madrid Protocol, which is essentially the same thing, but you file it through the Madrid Protocol. With these, however, you should bear in mind that even though you get a registration without use, you can't actually enforce either a Madrid Protocol registration or a 44E registration against a third party until such time as you yourself have put the mark into use. So what I'm talking about there is an infringement type action. Without use of a registration acquired through the Madrid Protocol, I can't actually enforce that mark against third party users. So that's kind of at a high level the principle upon which rights are obtained in the United States. It's a use-based system. First to use is the owner. You can also rely on constructive use, which ties to your filing date, but you will ultimately have to put the mark in use in most instances unless you go through 44E of the Madrid Protocol. But even in those instances, you still have to use to enforce. So that's the initial premise.
Thank you very much for